Fellowship has been out for a little over 5 weeks at this point, and we've seen a bit of a meta form in the higher rankings and throughout Fellowship itself. When looking through the different rankings for DPS heroes, you're probably noticing a pretty consistent theme here. The theme being the dominance of rhymes in higher rankings specifically. So in today's video, I want to jump into the topic of whether or not Fellowship has a rhyme problem, because there have been some updates to this, and I just kind of want to go over some of these updates and what it impacts in the overall meta for Fellowship. The first thing I want to highlight here is that Rime has so many players playing this particular hero. Of all of the recorded parses for DPS heroes, Rime has a total of 124,000 recorded parses, and for all of the other DPS heroes combined, including Rime, she accounts for about 40% of those DPS parses. So it's pretty substantial just how much this character is being played. But what is it that makes Rime such a desirable hero to play? And to answer this, I think it's actually a few different things. First off, Rime has a very simple rotation. She's a hero that doesn't really require quite as much of a cognitive load as someone compared to like Tarek or Mara. Rime is very straightforward on how you play this character, and even at a low level, she has a pretty simple, like front-loaded amounts of damage, and she doesn't really have a point where she falls off. She's really strong right out of the box, compared to, again, a hero like Mara, who really struggles until you get about 8 or 9 talent points. So Rime, in this sense, she's always going to be pretty strong. She always functions pretty well. And as a result, I think that makes her relatively popular. The other thing that makes Rime pretty strong is simply that she's a ranged DPS character. And this means you don't have the melee attacks where you have to move out for certain mechanics. You don't have to be as worried about like swirls on the ground and repositioning with a boss reposition, like when the tank moves and stuff like that, for example. There's just a lot less that you have to worry about in this sense. The other thing to highlight about Rime is that her damage profile is very strong. The build that they typically play uses the legendary back, which increases the AoE damage that you essentially do, because your freezing torrent, your beam build, is going to do more AoE damage, and it gets very strong. So the way that you tend to play this build is you focus very heavily on the beam talents, and this is going to make it so that your freezing torrent does massive amounts of damage, and it also cleaves in AoE. So you get this sense of doing priority damage with the freezing torrent. That's where most of your priority damage comes from. But then freezing torrent along with your legendary gives you more AoE damage. So it kind of double dips and causes the build for Rime to be extremely powerful. Another one of Rime's strengths is the fact that she has Frigid Winds, which is a 60-second knockback, which functions just like an interrupt. So this is very strong, and it being on a 60-second cooldown is extra powerful. The only other characters that have AoE kind of crowd control effects or interrupts, those would be Tariq and Ilarion. They have 2 minute, I think it's 2 minutes for both AoE interrupts. Ilarion's is very strong because it groups everyone up, but Tariq's interrupt is a fear, and this causes enemies to actually run away, which can be detrimental in some cases. So even though Tariq has an AoE interrupt, it's just nowhere near as relevant or powerful as Rime's. But we're still missing one key ingredient to the effects of Rime that are making her so powerful. And that missing piece is the interactions she has in her base kit with the Voidbringer's Touch weapon ability. For those of you who don't already know, Voidbringer's Touch is a weapon ability that targets a single enemy, and it applies a debuff to them that starts to pool or collect the different damage that you deal to that enemy, and it pools all of this damage dealt, and at the end of the debuff, or if the enemy's current health is lower than the damage that's been pooled up, it'll automatically pop that instance of damage and deal a massive single target burst of damage, And Rime has a weird interaction with this weapon, which is causing it to do just absurd amounts of damage. And I have an example of that here, where I just kind of cherry picked a little bit here and just grabbed one of the recent Eternal runs in the higher levels. I picked Keen here. But you can see here that Voidbringer's Touch, this is a weapon trait. It's dealing almost 20% of the hero's damage in this run. And I don't think it's intended for a single target weapon ability to be dealing almost the majority of your damage in a game that's kind of themed around doing a lot of AoE damage. So realistically, Rime is really benefiting from the effects of Voidbringer's Touch. As a result, Chief Rebel has taken notice of this and they've implemented a few changes. So the first change that's kind of coming in is, let me pull this up. The first change is that they're adjusting how quickly the damage accumulates. It's being reduced from 20% of damage dealt to now only be 10%. So this means that the pooling effect of Voidbringer's Touch is going to be a little bit lower. And then the second thing is it's accumulating less damage overall, only half of what the previous value was. However, the damage on Voidbringer's Touch is now guaranteed to be a critical strike, which means that it's going to benefit from, it's going to have 100% critical strike chance, which then gives you some of the Grievous crit chance, which means that it's going to benefit a little bit of a damage boost from your excess crit. So you're still getting a little bit of a damage boost, but this really just means that Voidbringer's Touch is now going to have higher lows in terms of damage, but much lower highs in terms of damage, because one of the things that was really causing Voidbringer's Touch to be so powerful is the fact that, like, in some of the highlights here, I'm not sure if you can see it here, but if Voidbringer's Touch would be a critical strike, it would deal 2 million damage in some instances. And if it wasn't a critical strike, it might only hit for like, a couple 100,000 instead. So this would mean that if you use Voidbringers and it did crit, you were feeling really good. If it did not crit, you were feeling pretty bad. So this just kind of smooths out the weapon's ability. And to compensate for this kind of change a little bit, they ended up buffing some of Rime's base damage, because I think Chief Rebel kind of realizes that Rime, even though she's very good, she's kind of propped up currently by the interactions with this weapon. So all of this is kind of just to say that there's not necessarily a Rime problem, more so it's a Voidbringer's Touch problem. And I think Chief Rebel has correctly identified this, and they're making these changes accordingly. And then also just one other update on the Voidbringer's Touch, I think, is that the cooldown was increased from a 60-second cooldown to a 90-second cooldown. This meant that Voidbringer's Touch was very easy to kind of line up with a lot of Rime's different cooldowns, which kind of gave it extra synergies, I suppose. But now that it's a 90-second cooldown, it kind of gets desynced from a lot of Rime's other cooldown abilities, so it kind of makes it a little bit more clunky. But I think this is a good change overall to nerf Voidbringer's Touch. I think maybe the cooldown reduction is a little excessive, but overall the way that damage is pooled and it being a guaranteed critical strike now, I think gives it a little bit more, just a little bit more consistency. I do think this doesn't really alter too much for Rime. I'm not really a Rime player, so I'll let people in the comments let me know just exactly how this impacts things. But my suspicion is that this opens up a lot more build variety for Rime, in that before she was kind of almost strictly tied to using Voidbringer's Touch, but now she's enabled to try out different weapons and see kind of what interactions can be built from there. Overall, I think this is a good way to kind of tune things right now, and we'll see how it kind of shapes up, because yeah, I think having the majority of your damage dealt be from a single target weapon, probably not the best design. So I think this is a step in the right direction. So once again, just to kind of summarize things, no, I don't think Fellowship has a Rime problem. She is the most popular DPS character to play, partially because she's doing a ton of damage, but also a lot of that damage is tied to some of her interactions with Voidbringer's Touch. And I know other heroes also have access to this weapon, but not quite to the same degree that Rime does. I think nerfing the weapon, I think Voidbringer's Touch is more of the problem than Rime and her interactions with it. So I think this is a good pivot for nerfs and balance. But overall, that's kind of what my opinion is on the recent kind of nerfs that we've seen. Let me know down in the comments how you guys feel about it. Do you feel like Rime really suffers now? Or do you think she overall kind of feels the same? Let me know down in the comments. But this is Gruber Troy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a terrific day.